Chapter 34. Eleanor's curiosity to see Mrs. Ferris was satisfied. She had found her in everything that she could tend to make a farther connection between the families undesirable. She had seen enough of her pride, her meanness, and a determined prejudice against herself to comprehend all the difficulties that must have perplexed the engagement, and retarded the marriage of Edward and herself, had he been otherwise free. And she had seen almost enough to be thankful for her own sake that one greater obstacle preserved her from suffering under any other of Mrs. Ferris' creations, preserved her from any dependence on her caprice, or any solicitude for her good opinion. Or at least, if she did not bring herself quite to rejoice in Edward's being fettered to Lucy, she determined that had Lucy been more amiable, she ought to have rejoiced. She wondered that Lucy's spirits could be so very much elevated by the civility of Mrs. Ferris, that her interest and her vanity should be so much blind to her, as to make the attention which seemed only paid to her because she was not Eleanor appear to compliment herself, or to allow her to derive encouragement from a preface only given to her because her real situation was unknown. But that it was so had not only been declared by Lucy's eyes at the time, but was declared over and over again the next morning more openly. At a particular desire, Lady Middleton set down in Berkeley Street only the change of seeing Eleanor alone to tell her how happy she was. The chance proved a lucky one, for a message from Mrs. Palmer soon after arrived, carried Mrs. Jennings away. "My dear friend," cried Lucy, as soon as they were by themselves, "I come to talk to you of my happiness. Could anything be so flattering as Mrs. Ferris's way of treating me yesterday? So exceedingly affable she was. You know how I dreaded the thoughts of seeing her, but the very moment I was introduced, there was such an affability in her behaviour as really should seem to say she had quite took a fancy to me. Now was it not so? You saw it all, and was not quite so struck with it." "She certainly was civil to you." "Civil? Did you see nothing but only civility? I saw a vast deal more. Such kindness as felt the share of nobody but me. Not pride, not hauteur, and your sister just the same. All sweetness and affability." Eleanor wished to talk of something else, but Lucy still pressed to her own that she had reason for her happiness, and Eleanor was obliged to go on. "Undoubtedly, if they had known of your engagement," she said, "nothing could be more flattering than their treatment of you. But as that was not the case—" "I guessed you would say so," replied Lucy quickly, "but there was no reason in the world why Mrs. Ferris should seem to like me, if she did not, and her liking of me is everything. You shan't talk me out of my satisfaction. I am sure it will all end well, and there will be no difficulties at all to what I used to think. Mrs. Ferris is a charming woman, and so is your sister. They are both delightful women indeed. I wonder I should never hear you say how agreeable Mrs. Dashwood was." To this Eleanor had no answer to make, and did not attempt any. "Are you ill, Miss Dashwood? You seem so low. You do not speak. Sure you aren't well." "I was never in better health." "I am glad of it with all my heart, but really you did not look it. I should be so sorry to have you ill, you that have been the greatest comfort to me in the world. Heavens knows what I should have done without your friendship." Eleanor tried to make a civil answer, though doubting her own success, but it seems to satisfy Lucy, for she directly replied, "Indeed, I am perfectly convinced of your regard for me, and next to Edward's love it is the greatest comfort I have. Poor Edward! But now there is one good thing. We shall be able to meet, and meet pretty often, for Lady Middleton's delighted with Mrs. Dashwood, so we shall be a good deal in Harley Street, I dare say, and Edward spends half his time with his sister. Besides, Lady Middleton and Mrs. Ferris will visit now, and Mrs. Ferris and your sister were both so good to say more than once that they should always be glad to see me. They are such charming women. I am sure if you ever tell your sister what I think of her, you cannot speak too high." But Eleanor would not give her any encouragement to hope that she should tell her sister. Lucy continued, "I am sure I should have seen it in a moment if Mrs. Ferris had took a dislike to me. If she had only made me a formal curtsy, for instance, without saying a word, and never after took any notice of me, and never looked at me in a pleasant way, you know what I mean. If I had been treated in that forbidding sort of way, I should have gave up in all despair. I should not have stood it, for where she does dislike, I know it is most violent. Eleanor was prevented from making any reply to this civil triumph, but by the doors being thrown open, and a servant announcing Mr. Ferris, and Edward's immediately walking in. It was a very awkward moment, and the countenance of each showed that it was so. They all looked exceedingly foolish, and Edward seemed to have as great an inclination to walk out the room again as to advance further into it. The very circumstance, in its unpleasant form, which they would each have been most anxious to avoid, had fallen on them. They were not only all three together, but they were together without the relief of any other person. The ladies recovered themselves first. It was not Lucy's business to put herself forward, and the appearance of secrecy must still be kept up. She could therefore only look her tenderness, and after slightly addressing him, said no more. But Eleanor had more to do, and so anxious was she, for his sake and her own, to do it well, that she forced herself after a moment's recollection to welcome him, with a look and manner that were almost easy and almost open. And another struggle, another effort still improved them. She would not allow the presence of Lucy, nor the consciousness of some injustice towards herself, to deter her from saying that she was happy to see him, and that she had very much regretted being from home when he called before in Berkeley Street. She would not be frightened from paying him those attentions which, as a friend and almost a relation, were his due by the observant eyes of Lucy, though she soon perceived them to be narrowly watching her. Her manners gave some reassurance to Edward, and he had courage enough to sit down, but his embarrassment still exceeded that of the ladies in a proportion which the case rendered reasonable, though his sex might make it rare, for his heart had not the indifference of Lucy's, nor could his conscience have quite the ease of Eleanor's. Lucy, with a demure and settled air, seemed determined to make no contribution to the comfort of others, and would say not a word, and almost everything that was said proceeded from Eleanor, who was obliged to volunteer all the information about her mother's health, their coming to town, etc., which Edward ought to have inquired about, but never did. Her exertions did not stop here, for she soon afterwards felt herself so heroically disposed as to determine, under the pretence of fetching Marianne, to leave the others by themselves, and she really did it, and that in the handsomest manner, for she loitered away several minutes on the landing-place with the most high-minded fortitude before she went to her sister. When that was once done, however, it was time for the raptures of Edward to cease, for Marianne's joy hurried her into the drawing-room immediately. Her pleasure at seeing him was like every other of her feelings, strong in itself and strongly spoken. She met him with a hand that would be taken, and a voice that expressed the affection of a sister. "Dear Edward," she cried, "this is a moment of great happiness. This would almost make amends for everything." Edward tried to return her kindness as it deserved, but before such a witness he dared not say half of what he really felt. And again they all sat down, and for a moment or two all were silent, while Marianne was looking with the most speaking tenderness, sometimes at Edward and sometimes at Eleanor, regretting only that their delight in each other should be checked by Lucy's unwelcome presence. Edward was the first to speak, and it was to notice Marianne's altered looks, and express his fear of her not finding London to agree with her. "Oh, don't think of me," she replied, with spirited earnestness, though her eyes were filled with the tears as she spoke. "Don't think of my health. Eleanor is well, you see. That must be enough for both of us." This remark was not calculated to make Edward or Eleanor more easy, nor to conciliate the good will of Lucy, who looked up at Marianne with no very benign expression. "Do you like London?" said Edward, willing to say anything that might introduce another subject. "Not at all. I expected much pleasure in it, but I have found none. The sight of you, Edward, is the only comfort it has afforded, and thank heaven you are what you always were." She paused. No one spoke. "I think, Eleanor," she presently added, "we must employ Edward to take care of us in our return to Barton. In a week or two, I suppose, we shall be going, and I trust Edward will be not very unwilling to accept the charge." Poor Edward muttered something, but what it was nobody knew, not even himself. But Marianne, who saw his agitation, could easily trace it to whatever cause best pleased herself, and was perfectly satisfied, and soon talked of something else. We spent such a day, Edward, in Harley Street yesterday. So dull, so wretchedly dull. But I have very much to say to you on that head, which cannot be said now. And with this admirable discretion she did defer the assurance of her finding their mutual relatives more disagreeable than ever, and of her being particularly disgusted with his mother, till they were more in private. But why were you not there, Edward? Why did you not come? I was engaged elsewhere. Engaged? But what was that, when such friends were to be met? Perhaps Miss Marianne, cried Lucy, eager to take some revenge on her. You think young men never stand upon engagement if they have no mind to keep them, little as well as great. Elinor was very angry, but Marianne seemed entirely insensible of the string, for she calmly replied, Not so indeed, for, seriously speaking, I am very sure that conscience only kept Edward from Harley Street, and I really believe that he has the most delicate conscience in the world, the most scrupulous in performing every engagement, however minute, and however it may take against his interest or pleasure. He is the most fearful of giving pain, of wounding expectation, and the most incapable of being selfish of anybody I ever saw. Edward is so, and I will say it. What, are you never to hear yourself praised? Then you must be no friend of mine, for those who will accept my love and esteem must submit to my open commendation. The nature of her commendation in the present case, however, happened to be particularly ill-suited to the feelings of 2/3 of her auditors, and was so very exhilarating to Edward that he very soon got up to go away. Going so soon? Said Marianne. My dear Edward, this must not be. And drawing him a little aside, she whispered her persuasion that Lucy could not stay much longer. But even this encouragement failed, for he would go, and Lucy, who would have outstayed him had his visit lasted 2 hours, soon afterwards went away. What can bring her here so often? Said Marianne on her leaving. Could she not see that we wanted her gone? How teasing to Edward! Why so? We were all his friends, and Lucy has been the longest known to him of any. It is but natural that he should like to see her as well as ourselves. Marianne looked at her steadily and said, You know, Elinor, that this is a kind of talking which I cannot bear. If you only hope to have your assertion contradiction, as I suppose must be the case, you ought to recollect that I am the last person in the world to do it. I cannot descend to be tricked out of assurances that are not really wanted. She then left the room, and Elinor dared not follow her to say more, for bound as she was by her promise of secrecy by Lucy, she could give no more information that would convince Marianne, and painful as the consequences of her still continuing in an error might be, she was obliged to submit to it. All that she could hope was that Edward would not often expose her or himself to the distress of hearing Marianne's mistaken warmth, nor the repetition of any other part of the pain that had attended their recent meeting, and this she had every reason to expect.